Yes, we can.
Awesome. Perfect. So welcome everyone to APA's Division 29, which is the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy. Our event today is called Gab with the Greats, and this event is hosted by the Early Career Psychology, the ECP Division 29 Committee. I am Dr. Michelle Joaquin. I'm a psychologist in private practice. I'm licensed in New York and California, and my main office is in Manhattan, New York. I am the Division 29 ECP Committee Chair. APA Division 29 has many different committees, including for students, for early career psychologists. They have a diversity committee, a social justice, private practice, and many more. So we're very happy to get new members to the division. So just wanted to put that link in the chat if anyone's interested in joining. So today we have a virtual interactive conversation with leaders in our field. Our discussion today will be focused on diversity and multiculturalism. I want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Rosemary Phelps, Dr. Derald and Dr. Melba Vasquez. We're very excited to have you here with us today. A few very quick housekeeping items before we begin. This session will be recorded, and we ask that you please keep your microphones muted. We will start by asking questions to our panelists, and we invite you to put any questions that you have in the Zoom chat because we'll be monitoring that, and then we'll be transitioning to answering those questions that the audience has put in the chat. And I will hand it over to Dr. Yujia Lei.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, our honored, speakers. I'm Dr. Yujia Lei. I'm currently a staff psychologist from Washington University in St. Louis. I'm the ECP rep at the Division 29. So I will be the moderator today. And first of all, I think I want to introduce, who they are, although I think everybody know who they are. But it's really great, for us to, kind of reveal, their achievement, yeah. So first, I will introduce Dr. Rosemary Phelps. Dr. Phelps is a professor of counseling psychology and currently director of training of the University of Georgia Counseling Psychology PhD program, which recently won the APA 2023 SWIM Minority Achievement Award. She served as department head from 2006 to 2012. She is a recipient of the 2010 APA Distinguished Contributions to Education and Training in Psychology Award and is an APA Fellow at Division 17. She has held numerous leadership positions in the Southeastern Psychological Association, with the most recent as president in 2018. She has built her career around teaching, research, and practice related to diversity issues, ethnic and racial identity development, professional issues for students and faculty of color, and mentoring students. Her professional activities have included national and regional membership and leadership positions in the APA and other organizations. She is currently the domain rep for the public interest and social justice domain of Division 29. In addition, Dr. Phelps developed the division's advocacy and mentoring program for diversity, which has been successfully in providing the professional development and mentoring opportunities for students of color. And I will introduce our second speaker is Dr. Derald. Dr. Derald is the professor of psychology and education in the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology at Teachers College, Columbia University. He was the co-founder of the National Multicultural Conference and Summit, co-founder and the first president of the Asian American Psychological Association, past president of the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity and Race, as well as the Society of Counseling Psychology. Dr. Su is a pioneer in the field of multicultural psychology, microaggression theory, racial dialogue, multicultural counseling and therapy, and the psychology of racism, anti-racism. He is author of 23 books and nearly 200 scholarly publications. His service has been widely sought by many groups and organizations. He has been done extensive culture diversity training for many Fortune 500 companies, institutions of higher education, governmental agencies, public schools, and mental health organizations. His most recent book, Micro-Intervention Strategies, How You Can Disarm and Disarm Individual and Systemic Racism and Bias in 2021, outlines specific individual actions that can be taken by targets, allies, and bystanders to counteract bias and discrimination. And last but not least, our very dear Dr. Melba Vasquez. She is a part-time independent practice in Austin, Texas. One of the most exciting periods in her career was when she served as the president of the American Psychological Association in 2011. She is the very first Latina and woman of color of 120 presidencies of APA to serve as in that role. Her theme for the 2011 APA convention was social justice. Her special presidential initiatives included examination of psychology's contribution to the ground challenge in society, including immigration, discrimination, and educational disparities. Dr. Vasquez is the co-founder of the APA Division 25, Society for the Psychological Study and Ethnic Minority Issues, and the National Multicultural Conference and Summit. Dr. Vasquez has published over 100 book chapters and journal articles in the areas of professional ethics, ethnic minority psychology, psychology of women, counseling and psychotherapy, and leadership. She has been honored with over 50 awards for distinguished professional contributions, career service, leadership, advocacy, and mentorship. Thank you all for being here and sharing your experience and wisdom with us today. Like Michelle and I have prepared some questions that we will ask the panel for the next 15 minutes. Whichever panelist wishes to answer the question, please get it started. We don't have a specific order. It's great if all the panelists want to answer each question, but you don't have to. Thank you. So maybe let's jump into our first question. What has influenced you thinking around DEI work and motivated you to get involved in being an advocate for change?
Well, this is Melba. I can start. First, let me thank you for the invitation to be here, and it's nice to see so many faces and names of colleagues, most of whom could also be on this panel. So it's nice to be here. The influences that motivated me to get involved in DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, were, first of all, my lived experiences as a Mexican American in South Texas, as a woman, and coming from a working class background. I noticed early on the disparate treatment of me and people like me, and it was disturbing. And so as I grew, even in elementary school, I noticed it. And as I moved into middle school and high school and then college, I started doing research in the area. And there have, also observing the treatment, the maltreatment, the marginalization of various other groups has caused me to prioritize the area. And so I was interested in what are the dynamics involved? Why is this happening? Why has it happened? What's the history involved? And also, how have we survived and thrived despite all those negative experiences? And so that motivated me to to get into the area. And even though I have been a practitioner, first at university counseling centers and then in private practice, I was also motivated to write because when I was a psychologist early on, there were very few psychologists of color to begin with and fewer writing. And so that motivated me to, the kind of writing I do is to research the field and to integrate and analyze and then to produce. So that's my response initially.
This is Rosemary. And similarly, my lived experience also had a great influence on my thinking around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I grew up in a small town, a rural town, actually, in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. The community in which I lived also had a historically Black college in the community. And so I was exposed early on to seeing people who were socially conscious and who sought to right various injustices that were occurring during that time. My parents actually created a model for me because I think in their own way, they were activists within the community and also outside of the community. The community was a safe space for me, and it was one that was nurturing. It was one that was encouraging. It was one that was inclusive. And promoting children of color at that time. And so during my career, I have really attempted to create a safe space for other students and develop a sense of belonging and community for others. And that has certainly been most of my career at a predominantly white institution, public land grant institution, and have been very intentional about trying to promote others. So that would be my response.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to be on a panel with Rosemary and Melba and to see some other names of people that I know. One of the things that people have asked me about is that how did you get into this particular field? How did you get interested in multiculturalism, in racism and anti-racism? And like Rosemary and Melba, I think a lot of it is lived experience. You know, I've written about this. One of the things that I recall early is my father immigrated from China when he was only 14. We lived as a family in Portland, Oregon's Chinatown, and almost all my neighbors, you know, and people that we associated with were Chinese. But later on, early in our lives, my father bought a home in Portland, Oregon, in the southeast district of Portland, Oregon, that was out of Chinatown. And he did it primarily because he wanted a larger house for the whole family to live in. And I recall that we were the only Chinese family. In fact, one of the few families of color in the southeast district of Portland, Oregon. And our first interaction with white classmates was when we went to Abernathy grade school. And as my brother Stan and my older brother my older brother Dave and I went to Abernathy grade school, I can recall incident after incident of teasing. We were never allowed to be part of the groups and among our peers. In fact, they would oftentimes surround us and you know, dance around us, chanting "Ching Chong Chinaman" and making strange sounds like "ee-ya, ee-ya," and laughing as if it was our language. And so we felt very much discriminated against and outsiders. But that, I recall, was not the major thing that affected me. This incident is burned in my memory. I was in front of, I think, my third grade class room talking to my brother Stan before classes were about to start. And we were talking to one another in Chinese. And my teacher had come out of our classroom, getting ready to shut the door, overheard us talking in Chinese and stormed up to me, I don't know why, and said, "Derald, you're in America now. When you're in America, you speak English. Now get into the classroom now." But I couldn't understand why she was, there was so much anger and meanness. And I stormed into my classroom and slumped down in my desk, being totally humiliated and feeling ashamed. What had I done? And I went back that day after school, and my mother was in the house washing dishes, and said to me, like any other, "How did your school day go?" And she asked me in Chinese. And I said to her, "Mom, I never want to talk to you in Chinese again, because that's the reason why we're not liked here." And I stormed up to my room. And it was only years later that I realized this was something unfolding in terms of how, as a Chinese American, that this society made me feel ashamed, or maybe I allowed myself to feel ashamed of who and what I was. And it took a long time. When I went to graduate school, I encountered different aspects in which the curriculum, the theories of counseling and psychotherapy. I was a graduate student at the University of Oregon. I couldn't relate to it. I loved psychology. I did well in psychology. But when they talked about family systems, this was not my lived reality. And after I graduated, the thing that cemented it more than anything else was my first job was at the University of California, Berkeley. And at that time, I would say about 25% of clients that came to the center were Asian Americans. And I realized that what I was taught did not relate to their lived experience. For example, what I found was that oftentimes they would come in with, somatic problems, inability to sleep, poor appetite, or they would come in for vocational counseling, educational counseling. And I realized that those were not the real issues that they were coming in with, but they were presenting their social, personal problems in a way that was much more acceptable in terms of Asian. And all the things that I've taught begin to manifest in the sense that psychological disorders are manifested quite differently depending upon race, culture, ethnicity, and gender. And to think from a white Western European perspective about what we should do in terms of treatment was inappropriate. And that was my movement away from really accepting a white Western European way of thinking as the only legitimate means of asking and answering questions about the human condition.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your lived experience. I feel like that's, most of the therapists of color's direct experience coming from, like we are all from a different cultural background. Actually, that leads me to the next question, which is, how do cultural values and beliefs impact the counseling process? And what strategies do you use to navigate those differences with clients?
You want me to go first again, guys?
Doesn't have to be any specific order. So you can
I
go
know,
ahead.
I know. I think our responses were so similar in terms of our early experiences, in terms of how that influenced our, right? And I think that we talked mostly about negative experiences and discrimination and bias. And so that is one aspect of our clients that we have to explore and assess if they seem relevant to their distress. But I think in addition to that, there's a different set of cultural values and beliefs that come with racial and ethnic identity. And actually, we need to consider the intersectionality. Derald referred to this, of not only race and ethnicity, but gender and sexual orientation and religion, spirituality, and social class, and so on. And we have to assess, gosh, therapy is such a complex process. We have to assess to what degree those strands of identity influence their distress and dysfunction, because those affect us in different ways, uniquely. And but they also affect, those strands of identity also affect our strengths and resilience. So we need to continuously assess, as we're working with someone, how their issues, their problems, their presenting concerns are influenced by those strands of identity, and in what ways, which are at the forefront, which are at the background, which need to be brought forth, and so on. So they're very, very important, and important for us to be able to assess. And navigating those issues, first of all, we have to be as aware as possible. That's lifelong learning, continuous assessment, and so on. But our client is our best educator. We have to ask questions and assess and figure out. I have several examples I'll talk about later if I get a chance.
I'm happy to go next, and would follow what Melba was saying in terms of the three of us, she, Derald, and I talked about the impact of our lived experiences. I think it's also important that we really have conversations with our clients about their lived experiences also. And I think we would all probably agree that it's important to navigate those cultural values and beliefs as part of the therapy process. And it really does show up in the work that we do as therapists, as clinicians, and also I think as academicians. I think in the therapeutic setting, those cultural values and beliefs that need to be navigated include things around the diagnostic process, the affective presentation of clients, the presenting concerns and issues that clients bring to therapy. Also, the dynamics, the different dynamics between clinicians and therapists, between clinicians and clients. The cultural values can impact the interventions that we choose to use with clients as well. And certainly, I think cultural values and beliefs influence and impact worldviews of both therapists and clients. When I think about an academic setting, I think we can see this, and it's important that we attempt to understand and honor and work with our students in ways that are congruent with their worldviews and their experiences. And we often broach, I think, cultural differences. We are kind of on point to talk about cultural differences, but I think it's also important to talk about cultural similarities as well. And with students in academic settings, just the importance of dealing with a new environment that can be oppressing and non-honoring of their cultural values and beliefs. That would be my response.
You know, there's something that in 2021, the American Psychological Association issued a public apology for their role in racism and the perpetual of racism and complicity in terms of racism. I was on the apology subcommittee that gave input into this. And out of that, I've achieved a number of different insights. If we apply this apology as it relates to just the aspect of counseling and psychotherapy. And I've concluded, along with a number of other individuals, that, counseling and psychotherapy, the process does not allow for the legitimization of the lived experience that our clients talk about. In fact, one of the things that we recently wrote in an article that will be published by Helen Neville, Laura Smith, and I in the American Psychologist is entitled "Racism in Counseling and Psychotherapy: Illuminate and Disarm." And our hypothesis and thesis derived from the apology subcommittee is that that cultural racism, white supremacy, and a white epistemology overrides and overarches the aspect of counseling and psychotherapy, and that it is manifested throughout psychological training. We are accepted for doctoral individuals into an APA accredited program. We adhere to the ethical codes of standards that are present there. We seek APA approved internships, and finally, we take the EPPP licensing exam. In all of those processes here, if racism tints all aspects of it, you would expect that the types of help and delivery that we give would be inappropriate and biased in some way. And what we did was to look at the foundational pillars of counseling and psychotherapy, and we identified 4 of them. The 4 was universalism over relativism, objectivism over subjectivism, individualism over collectivism, and empiricism over experientialism. And we indicate how that because of those pillars, for example, universalism over relativism fosters color and power blindness. Individualism over collectivism tends to blame the victim. Objectivism over subjectivism dehumanizes individuals and tends to attribute them as outsiders. And empiricism over experientialism denies the lived experience of people of color. And these are all embedded in a white epistemology that asks and answers questions about the human condition, and that gives what I call therapeutic taboos about what one does in counseling and psychotherapy and what is non-therapeutic. For example, if you look at the whole process here, it means that that a therapist does not give advice and suggestions. A therapist does not serve dual relationships. A therapist does not self-disclose their own thoughts and feelings. And a therapist creates clear boundaries between them and their clients. Now, there is a reason for why those therapeutic taboos originate from white Western European, counseling therapy, but in essence, what we've come out with and concluded is that we've moved to the other extreme, and when they come out, they are very oppressive, harmful, silencing to clients of color, and that we need to begin to realize that there are other epistemologies, other ways of being, other ways of knowing, and other ways of behaving that are not centered in Euro-American, and I haven't even gone into the fact that if you look at all the theories that we're taught of counseling and psychotherapy, they originate from primarily white Western European men, not even women. And you cannot tell me that these major individuals, well-intentioned as they may be, did not inherit the biases of the society, and that shows its way really in terms of their basic concepts of what counseling and psychotherapy is all about.
Thank you. Thank you all name the various visible and invisible identities of therapists and clients and how important to address the intersectionality as well as, the 4 overs. I feel like Dr. Su just mentioned. I feel like that's actually lead to my, next question. What role does historical context play in perpetuating systemic discrimination? And how can psychologists assist client in processing this? And we don't have a specific order.
I think, Rosemary, that was an invitation for you to go first this time.
Thanks, Melba. I think historical context plays a major role because there has been oppression and racism and other forms of ism, along with power and privilege, that we can trace throughout history. And so I think there are ways in which that shows up. We see things in therapy like racial trauma, clients dealing with racial trauma, vicarious trauma, intergenerational trauma. And so we need to address those things and to help people heal from those traumas. I think it's also important to think about that organizations and systems also have a history, and that we need to, as well as help clients and others, understand what that history is and how they can help navigate and maneuver within those systems. So that would be my response.
Well, let me go ahead and also respond. I think, I saw Hector Adames' name there. He and Nayeli Chavez Dueñas and Ken Pope and I are writing an article on decolonization. That's one way to think about what Derald was talking about, that we have not only been colonized in regard to property by European white men, but also our intellectualism, And so how to decolonize is part of what Derald's article was talking about. And that's all very exciting. I think that's the state of the art right now, is to figure out how do we pull out of those oppressive ways of thinking and implementing our theories and research. And so, I also want to point out that many of you young people weren't around when the talk among psychologists was we should not get involved in advocacy, social advocacy, especially because we will alienate our legislators who are conservative and blah, blah, blah. Well, I think many of us have pushed for advocacy for change when we see and we understand the various policies and rules and laws that serve to barriers to access, not only to mental health, but to education, to ways of being building wealth, and so on. And I would go so far as to say that we have an ethical obligation to engage in social justice at whatever levels, in whatever ways make sense for us. In the book that Joe Johnson and I wrote on multicultural therapy, a practice imperative, I have a quote that I want to read to you that I loved when we came up with it. We said, social justice demands that we walk the talk of advocacy, attending marches, contacting our legislators and government policymakers, writing editorials, visiting, volunteering, contributing, and voting. It demands that we ensure that our offices and meeting places are barrier-free. We lobby for LGBTQ equality, fight against racist immigration practices, and support religious equity. The multicultural therapist can advocate for social justice, as the saying goes, by speaking truth, power, and privilege. So I'll stop right there.
You know, this question, concerning the history and how it affects psychological practice and theory and research is an important one. And I'm reminded by the book by Robert Guthrie. I think many of you know it. The book is called Even the Rat Was White. And his assertion was that the history of psychology is a history of racism, of bias, of leaving out the contributions of people of color, and that it is primarily white Western European. And again, I go back to the resolution passed in APA apology. They point out that the first president of the American Psychological Association, G. Stanley Hall, that other leaders like Lewis Terman, Edward Thorndike, all of these famous psychologists that we attribute contributions were proponents of Nazi theories of genetic inferiority, and the belief, their beliefs inundated the whole field of counseling and therapy. And if you explore the writings historically, there was a movement in terms of almost the assumption in psychology that people of color were genetically inferior. And then in the late 1950s and 1960s, Reisman's book, The Culturally Deprived Child, was seen as a major breakthrough. It had nothing to do with genetics, but what it did was that it put the blame on the lifestyles, the cultural values. In fact, there were terms such as culturally deprived, culturally deficient, and it didn't make sense because how can groups not have a culture? What they were saying in essence was that people of color didn't have the right culture. And this has created a curriculum that tends to make many of us, for example, I went to school and was taught that Columbus discovered America. Now, the thing, I accepted it. But think about it this way, in Lowen's book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, he uses this exact example about how by saying, it's a falsehood. It was Columbus that was lost. He thought he discovered the continent of India, but it was portrayed that a white male European was elevated as the discoverer, and all the indigenous people were discoverees. And the power of that is, that you soak this up and you go through life thinking that, yes, white Western men are the discoverers, those in the leadership position. But even more damaging is what it does to, let's say, indigenous students, in which a teacher decides that I'm going to, give a test to my class, and the test is a question, very straightforward question. Columbus discovered America, true or false? Well, if you're a Native individual and you know the real history, you decide to say, no, it's false. Well, what happens? The teacher marks it wrong. Johnny Lone Tree, study your history. You have it wrong. If you decide to go along with it and say it's true, you have sold out your integrity. This is how insidious and indirect these messages, I call them meta communications, especially when we talk about microaggressions. These are on the surface, it seems appropriate, but the hidden messages are put downs. You're incompetent, you're inferior, you're an outsider, you're an intruder, you're a criminal, you're dangerous. These are the messages that are beneath the surface. And the problem that I think not only that are white individuals growing up thinking that they are privileged, and it's that targets such as myself when I was young incorporate these messages and begin to think it's my language that is bad. It's being Asian that is bad. It's looking this way that is bad. And so, this is something I think in which we have to begin to understand the power of history. History is reality. The group that owns history is the group that holds power in its ability to determine reality. And this is where I think it's difficult to liberate ourselves from this overarching umbrella that is constantly rewarding us as long as we go along with what is being done.
Thank you. I'm taking notes, a lot of notes from all of you. I think I'm going to ask the last question, and I want to open the Q&A. The last question is an action question. I think this generation of counseling psychologists, I think people really want to do something, we're not being aware, we want to do things. So how can counseling psychologists address and promote social justice and advocate for marginalized communities within and outside of the counseling room?
Well, I think we have to figure out ways to take action as individuals, but as groups as well. I think we are living in a very, very horrific time when there is a backlash to the progress that has been made. I live in Texas. I think Texas and Florida and a few other states are horrific examples of book banning DEI being taught. There was an article last week in the Texas Tribune about how 1,900 faculty members across the state universities are trying to leave Texas because the atmosphere is so oppressive, and it is just a very difficult, hard time. And so like Derald was saying, it's very difficult to take a stand when you're going to be punished for it. But we have to figure out how to do that. And I think when it's not easy. It's more pragmatic to do so with our organizations and our groups than as individuals, but we have to do it in both ways and to figure out how to do that. That's my short answer initially.
So I certainly agree with Melba and would add to that list of states, Georgia, as we are dealing with the legislature has passed this divisive concepts law. And so most recently, we have had a local, an Atlanta teacher who was fired for one of the books that she read to her students. And so, you know, it really is kind of figuring out and not being afraid to continue to do the work that we know needs to be done. Melba mentioned both like in terms of group, but also again, as individuals and among various different groups, I think is important. And I think Melba also kind of indicated, and I certainly agree with that, that the roles can look very different when engaging in social justice and advocacy activity. And so social justice activity can look very different. And we need all of those different activities to be able to press forward and to move ahead. I think intentionality is important just because of the climate that we're in and the kinds of issues that we are having to address, so that intentionality is important. I think understanding within organizations, the structure of an organization, the functions of that organization, and the culture of the organization, if we're going to be effective in kind of promoting social justice and being strong advocates. I think the other thing is recognizing it's a 24/7 job. It's a 24/7 kind of activity. And that can be really, really exhausting. You get tired and sometimes give out, but I think not to ever give up. But I think, you know, there are ways that what we do in terms of advocacy, it can be uplifting. Because we build a community with like-minded people. We have our identities affirmed in ways that we don't often get in those oppressive systems. So I do think, again, that I think moving with intentionality is important. And I will stop there.
You know, I agree with you, Rosemary. One of the important, and with Melba, actually, you're touching upon the fact that building social support and allies is extremely important when it comes to issues of social advocacy, because in essence, there is not only safety in numbers, but strength in numbers. And obtaining social support is not only validating to your own identity, but it immunizes and reinforces you to continue the fight, which can be exhausting. And I think that a number of people have written about this as racial battle fatigue. And you know, how do we generate a movement and forward movement? And one of them is social advocacy. But again, if I contrast that with the traditional role of counseling and psychotherapy, it doesn't address that issue. I'm reminded of a major address by a colleague who passed long ago, Don Atkinson. Maybe Melba's, you know, you and I knew Don, maybe Rosemary as well. He was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. and he gave a talk called How Multiculturalism Saved Counseling Psychology. And what his work dealt with the fact that counseling and psychotherapy roles are only one roles available to the helping professional. There are ombudsman roles. There are advocacy roles. There are facilitator of indigenous healing roles. There are all these different roles. But in counseling and psychotherapy, we just talked about the one-to-one helping role, which in essence constrains us from beginning to look as if our responsibility is to change institutional structures. And it is difficult to do because of the personal, social, and economic costs that can be brought down upon you when you try to make system changes. And that's where I go back again, how important it is for you to have, as Rosemary says, a group of like-minded individuals who validate who you are, what you're doing, and can offer advice, strength for you to impact the system. But that is one thing that I think very important, that counseling psychology, I really am quite pleased with the field, that it is one of the major divisions that has branched out in terms of multicultural social advocacy. If you look at, that's why I belong to counseling psychology. If you look at all of the guidelines that have come out, gender, race, multicultural, all of, they almost have originated from Division 17. And how it occurred, I have no idea. I still find my clinical brothers and sisters way behind in terms of this. In fact, I'm in the Department of Counseling and Clinical Psychology. We have a very multicultural counseling program, but our clinical program, as much as I like my colleagues, they have a completely different philosophy. And oftentimes when our students cross-take courses, clinical people think that we're not, we're merging, our roles and everything else. But this is something that I think is becoming more and more important in terms of social advocacy.
Thank you. Thank you. We're getting close to the end of this panel, but we will have the Q&A and the book raffle so people can stay. And there, I feel like maybe we get the last round of the word of wisdom. So if there is one thing you would like the audience to take away from the session, what would it be?
There are too many, Dr. Lee.
I know. I feel like I want to kidnap all of you. Give us another 2 days, conversation.
I've learned listening to my colleagues, so it's hard to, narrow down. I had an example. This is going back to the counseling and psychotherapy thing, but just this week I saw a new client. She was last week rather. She's a 70-some-odd-year-old Mexican American woman. Well, Mexican. Naturalized. She came over as a child and became a naturalized citizen. And she has many adverse childhood experiences, and she has been in therapy before. She came to me because she decided she wanted a Latina psychologist. And she said, I got lots of good benefit from my previous therapist. She was a white woman. She was wonderful. She helped me out a lot during a very difficult period of my life. It had been many years. She said, but there was one thing that I knew was a cultural difference. And I want to know what you would say to this. She said, when my mother had dementia, I got together, I organized a whole lot of my family members, extended family, to have a barbecue because my mother used to love barbecue. And the therapist said, "Oh no, don't do that. That will confuse her. That is dangerous for her. Do not do that." She said, "Would you agree with that?" I said, "Absolutely not." That was probably, I don't know what happened. I don't know what you did, but that was probably would have been one of the best things for your mother. She said, "I did it and it was wonderful." She said, "That's what I'm talking about." Because, Mexicanos like big gathering. Well, I shouldn't stereotype, but in general, the Mexican culture likes big gatherings, family, food, and family was probably the best medicine for most illnesses of any kind, including dementia. So I just wanted to give an example of how knowing the culture can make a difference, and any wide variety of therapies can be helpful for a wide variety of clients, but there are nuanced information that we have as a culture, or that we can learn about cultures, that makes a difference.
Thank you so much. Anyone else have any? Go ahead.
I was just going to add, and it's more around kind of stamina, but to keep your eyes on the prize, and to know that that your work and what you're doing and the advocacy things, that work is not in vain. Like, you may not see the immediate outcomes, but know, if you hold true to your values and your beliefs, that to just keep your eyes on the prize. And I think I had said a bit earlier that you may get tired, and well, you get tired, certainly, and you may give out, but don't give up. Just don't give up. And amongst all of that is to take time for self-care, figuring out what self-care means for you and what self-care looks like for you. And just be sure to take care of self as well. Because I think as therapists, you oftentimes, and in other settings as well, we're carrying the load and the burden and the drama and the trauma of others, while we're also dealing with our own. And so it's important, I think, to remember the self-care component as well. And that would be it for me.
I also agree, Rosemary, that self-care is really important element. I have a different take in terms of what the prize is. One of the things that I've often asked myself as I engage in this anti-racism work and getting all the pushback that occurs with it, is, what is the prize for me? Is it to see the eradication of racism? I know Dr. Martin Luther King and most of the leaders of color believe that someday we will be able to eradicate racism. Well, I really don't believe that. And as a result, there was a period in my life where I went through a process of, what am I doing then? Why am I persisting in doing this if indeed I don't believe that we will ever eradicate racism? And I went through a depressed period for, I think, a couple of months until it dawned on me that for me, the doing is as important as the outcome, because the doing itself is an expression of my own humanity, my values, and I'm not going to allow other people to prevent that from being heard and accepted. So I oftentimes tell students, when I share with them this, that each of them needs to find the prize that will keep them motivated and keep them going on. That's what I would say. The doing is important as the outcome.
Thank you all. Yeah,
Could I add
Yeah.
a brief? I would say that both Rosemary and Derald are right. I think we need the little wins along the way. We need to feel a little bit of progress, you know, in the efforts that we make. And Derald, I agree that it's the engagement. You know, in working with depressed clients, one of the best antidepressants is taking action. And so one of the things to do about anything that's bothering you is to take action to try to do something about whatever it is that's bothering you. And so the engagement is so important. And I'm so glad you both talked about self-care, because we can get burned out so easily, especially when it's discouraging. I just wanted to underscore that as well. So.
Thank you. Because this is like the virtual, but I bet if we are, you know, in person, you will get rounds and rounds of, you know, applause. Thank you so much. I think Michelle will take it over for the Q&A. We got a lot of questions.
Yes, we definitely did receive a lot of questions. Okay, so we're gonna open it up, and I'm gonna go with one of the first questions that I received. As an aspiring counseling psychologist, how do we engage in social justice and advocacy as we conduct research and expand the psychological literature?
There's so much to do. One of the things that I have felt myself doing is relaxing in the last few years, because there's so many young people doing such great work. I don't have to do anything anymore. So that's great. But I don't know how to answer that except to say, look at what interests you, look at what piques your interest, look at the models of research that you have been exposed to. You know, there are so many new models out there, and you know, Derald was talking about you know, we don't have to just use the experimental, you know, gold standard model of research. There are many ways to do research these days, you know, interviews, observational, you know, and so on. But you know, I think looking to mentors around you and people who know you and who know what you might be interested or good at would be a way to go.
You know, I would say, one, recognize that in many circles, people may not see your research as valuable or relevant. But again, being in communities who, in which social justice work and research is valued, that will be your supportive community. And so again, finding mentors, finding research mentors who have that same kind of commitment, if you will, to conduct culturally sensitive, culturally appropriate research may be one way to go as well.
Dr. Su, do you have any comments? It's okay if you don't.
No, I don't. I think that it's been touched upon well by Melba and Rosemary.
Good. I did get one question specifically to Dr. Vasquez. I am hearing all three of you name how deeply some toxic colonizing notions have been instilled even in our racial ethnic minorities. Could you share your insights on how Black Latinx and white Latinx individuals may work together to address the differences in experiences and outcomes that they experience among Latinx? And how can we, as psychologists and researchers, work towards addressing these disparities effectively while recognizing the intersectionalities of identities within the Latinx community?
Well, I think it is very, very important to work toward working together and in whatever arenas the work is being done. I think issues come up sometimes when there are differences or conflicts, or I remember a colleague who got in a position of power, and she was a person of color, and she said, "I can't believe I got attacked by all these people of color." And it was sort of like, well, okay, you weren't attacked, it's that people wanted more because you're in a position of power, so it's so important to stay open to communication, to be non-defensive, to listen, to hear each other, to communicate. We're supposed to be good at communication. We have to remember to apply those skills in the context of conflict or differences, but to assume the best and to move forward on whatever issues or projects or goals our people are working on. I'm not sure that answers the question, but that's what comes up in the mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vasquez. Another question, as a therapist of color, how can we empower ourselves or ground ourselves when working with culturally privileged clients? What dynamics need to be considered, and how do we navigate these encounters in client-counselor relationships?
Well, this is, I'm going to take the privilege of answering again, because that's one I've worked with and talked about and written about a little bit. It is very, very, when I was younger and I would have a tall 6 foot something white male who was a CEO of something walk in my office, it was hard not to feel intimidated and not to feel easily triggered by microaggressive comments and so on. But I trained myself. I think I saw Linda Campbell on here a while ago. I can't remember if it was with you, Linda, or somebody else, where we had the conversation about working with the humanity of whoever was sitting in front of us. And so regardless of who the person was, white person with privilege, it's so important to remember that pain is pain is pain, and people are there because they're in distress, and they may not be exhibiting it in ways that are easy to address or engage with, but it is there. And it is my job as a therapist to move past the off-putting behaviors or whatever, and to go there to their humanity and to engage in that way. And that is what I'm constantly reminding myself when I work with anybody who's challenging or difficult.
Okay, Melba, if I can ask you, you mentioned the fact that it's very difficult for a therapist to work with a client with power and privilege, and to deal with the microaggressive comments that may come out. What are your thoughts? I mean, because you're more a practitioner than I think any of us. And, in terms of the research I'm aware of, especially the research of Jesse Owen at Denver and other individuals, what we're finding out, for example, is that the greatest perpetrators of microaggressions in education are not students to student, but professor to student. And what Owen's study is also indicating is that that therapists are frequently the instigator of microaggressions towards their clients. But if we reverse it, if you're a therapist, how do you handle, do you call out or don't call out microaggressions from individuals that occur?
Yes, it depends. Is it that, that has become an easy one for me because, if it's a new relationship and I don't have a bond with them yet, I note it in my notes and I move on, and it may not be the first thing we address, but eventually, if the bond evolves and becomes a good one, I will, it is almost always part of their issues. People are in therapy because they have issues, and many times people who are flippant with their comments and so on are off-putting to people around them in general, not just to people of color, but in general, to women, to other people. And so, what I do is hold up a mirror at some point where I feel like there's and I train myself to say things in a hearable way. You may not intend this, but do you realize that when you say things like this, that it pushes people away from you? Is that what you want? Is that the outcome that you want? Essentially. So it's easier to do it in the therapeutic context, in my experience, than it would be to a professor, than it would be, to your own therapist. Although, it depends on who. Well, that's another thing. But I would encourage clients to do that with their therapists, and therapists are supposed to be willing to listen to clients who are upset with them. So that's my response, Derald. I don't know if that makes sense to you, or if maybe other people, maybe other listeners have suggestions or experiences that they want to contribute, because that's an important one.
So that's a very important one. Thank you. I did see one question that kind of goes off of what we're saying now. Actually, how do I respect a client's culture if their culture devalues women or people with dark skin?
They try to tackle that. Now, one of the things that I always tell trainees is that counseling and psychotherapy is not value neutral. And that when there are issues that in some sense denigrate individuals or create inequitable situations, I say that the counselor or therapist needs to take an educative role. And when you present it, it's very important. I think Melba was saying that you make note of it and you therefore bring it out when it seems therapeutically appropriate. It's not necessary that you jump on it immediately unless it calls for immediate action. For example, if colorism is operative here, and you as a therapist, share in that the group that is being demeaned, I think that you would bring it out and talk about it in one way or another.
So I would agree with what has been said, and I'm not sure, I just maybe reiterating what has been said. I think the timing of it is an important issue, and the pacing of it in when addressing those kinds of things in therapy. I keep going back to the self-care piece and just being reminded of not wanting to be in some ways re-traumatized, if you will. But so I do think it's important to think about the timing, the pacing, and taking care of self in that regard, what I would add.
You know, one of the things that I also would say is that, you know, we're talking mainly now about targets of bias or discrimination and talking about self-care and so forth. And I don't want us to go away with the notion that it is always the responsibility of targets to deal with bias and discrimination, that there is a whole area of work now that deals with what we call, if we talk about racism, white allies and bystanders. How do you activate bystanders? And, you know, when I point out a microaggression as a person of color to someone else, there are things that I have to consider as potential consequences. But even a person who has a certain degree of power and privilege, who is an ally or a bystander, has potential negative consequences that are imposed of them if they choose to intervene. And yet it is very important, so that in some of the work that we've been doing, how do we get white allies to actually take action? And I go back to Janet Helm's work, that it's more, it's not just being non-racist that is important. It's being anti-racist, which means action taking. And in the work that I've done with students here, what I find that many of them are able to develop a non-racist attitude and belief. And they can recognize racism on TV commercials. They can see it happening in their friends. But when they are asked, did you do anything about it? The answer was generally no, or hesitations, or vague responses. And so one of the things that our training is aimed at is, how do we get allies and bystanders to begin to take action? And we begin to ask them, well, why did you hesitate to take action? And we would hear answers like, well, you know, I was told by my, you know, they'd go home, you know, Indigenous Peoples Day for holidays, and they would hear a favorite uncle tell a racist joke. They would object to it. And because they took Dr. Seuss' course on race, you know, racism, and they objected to it or interceded, and they were shushed by their parents or others around them. This is your favorite uncle. What are you doing here? You're disrupting family harmony. If you keep this, or worse yet, what are they teaching you at that liberal college that we pay so much money to put you through? You know, if you keep this up, we won't see you as a part of the family anymore. What I suddenly realized was that even white allies have pushback that makes them, their loss of power and privilege, isolation, being called a white liberal, a do-gooder, you know, all of these negative things come up. The consequences are different than individuals of color, but they are nevertheless societal forces that keep you in place from interceding or bringing things out. And for bystanders, what I find wrong with the bystander literature is it assumes that they can recognize bias. And we find, again, from the microaggression work, that bystanders don't take action because they dismiss it as that I don't see bias. In fact, when I give them the example that people compliment me for speaking good English, they would say, that's not microaggression, that's a compliment. You're misreading what's going on. And bystanders don't have critical consciousness. And so with all of these groups, I think What needs to be done is to show target survival skills, intervention skills, to have white allies work through to go beyond and become anti-racist in their actions, to get bystanders to begin to realize and recognize what is invisible to them. And microaggressions to a lot of people are very invisible. Or even Jack Davidio's work on aversive racists, that they are unaware of the biases that they harbor. But because of being unaware of it, they are likely to come out in situations that are out. If they're aware of it, they can control it. If they're unaware of it, it comes out. And I see this happening in counseling and psychotherapy with therapists. I see this happening with teachers. I see this happening with well-intentioned managers who engage in microaggressions. And the reason why it persists is the power imbalance. That if you raise your voice and object or challenge or confront or call out a biased behavior, there may be serious consequences. You don't get that raise or promotion. You don't graduate. You don't be, all of these things. And so teaching these categories of individuals of how to deal with these obstacles is something that Lisa Spanierman and I are working strongly in terms of beginning to deal with the challenges and how to overcome them.
Derald, I would add that we are all victims, if you will, of our own exposure to all kinds of biases and so on, and we all commit microaggressions. And we have to be, one way to be supportive of each other is to let each other know when we experience that from each other in hearable ways. I would have loved to have worked with that young person about how to talk to his uncle or her uncle about the joke. There are ways to say things in a way that are more hearable than others, but I just wanted to add that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We did receive so many questions, and I apologize for not being able to get to all of them. Since I see we have about 3 minutes left, we are going to transition to announce the 5 winners of the book raffle right now. If we say your name, we'll ask that you please, you can either put your address on the chat and send it directly to either me or Dr. Lei. Or you can just put, if you don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine. You can put your email in the chat, and we will email you and ask you for your address so we can mail a book from our presenters. And I apologize ahead of time if, and it's 4 books. I apologize. So we're going to announce the 4 winners. Erica Lampert. We have Erica Lampert here. I do see Erica Lampert still here, so it's great if you can send us. Oh, awesome. Ashley Gonzalez. And Nadi Paranamana. Our 4th winner is Winnie Wilson. And actually, no, it is 5 books. So I apologize. 5 winners. And so our 5th person will be, click on this again, Dash Yeo. So I'm going to give you all a second to, oh wait, where did my chat go? To respond in the chat. Perfect. I'm already getting responses. Ashley, are you here? And Nadi, Winnie, and Dash. I'm going to give it a minute to see if those folks respond. If not, I might have to move on. Okay, I am seeing the responses. Great. If Erica, Winnie, Nadi has responded. And I'm looking, waiting for Ashley. Ashley Gonzalez. And to clarify, you can provide us with your address if you feel comfortable sending it to, preferably send it to me since I'm kind of doing this right now. And if you don't feel comfortable putting your address in the chat, then you can just provide me with your email and we will send you the books. And I am not seeing Ashley respond, so I'm gonna announce one more winner. 1 second. Ashley Gonzalez, okay. And then our last winner then will be, oh, Lucia, okay, never mind. Okay, awesome. So thank you. So we wanna thank our amazing speakers. I know we're out of time. Thank you, Dr. Phelps, Dr. Su, Dr. Vasquez for today's riveting conversation. I personally learned so much today. Thank you to all who attended our Gap with the Greats panel. Again, here's the link for folks who do want to join Division 29, which is the Society for the Advancement of Psychotherapy. Today's Gap with the Great event was actually hosted by APA's Division 29's Early Career Psychology Committee. And this video will be up in our YouTube page in these upcoming month or hopefully sooner. Actually, I'll even put the YouTube page for Division 29. Well, thank you all for attending and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.